I think we're ready. Yes? Are we ready to start? Wonderful. So, good evening and good afternoon, and welcome to all of you that are connected with us today. My name is Rosa Celorio, and I'm Associate Dean for International and Comparative Legal Studies at GW Law School. And welcome to this event in which we're going to be discussing immigration in times of crisis. And before I share with you some introductory remarks, I actually want to share with you some information about the amazing speakers that we have today. We're very privileged to be able to have these amazing practitioners and thinkers in the area of immigration law today. So we have first Alberto Benitez, who's actually a professor of clinical law at GW Law School and the director of our immigration clinic. And before joining GW Law School, he was on the faculty of the legal clinics at Chicago Kent College of Law and Northwestern University. Prior to becoming a clinician, he was a staff attorney at the Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law and the Legal Assistance Foundation of Chicago, as well as an intern at the Centro de Estudios Legales y Sociales in Buenos Aires, Argentina. In addition, in the summers, he has taught at the law schools of the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, el ITAM, and the Universidad Panamericana in Mexico City. And we also have with us today, and this is particularly special because she's our alum, Anam Rahman. And Anam is a partner at the law firm Calderon Seguin PLC, located in Fairfax, Virginia. And her immigration practice covers a broad array of matters, including non-immigrant and immigrant visas, family-sponsored petitions, waivers of inadmissibility, asylum, humanitarian relief, and all forms of relief from removal. She also specializes on asylum and removal defense, including direct representation of detained individuals, and regularly appears before the Arlington and Baltimore immigration courts. She also represents clients in seeking affirmative and appellate matters before various agencies and federal courts. And she's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown Law School, teaching the Women and Immigration Fieldwork Practicum, and a board member of Asylum Works. Needless to say, it's wonderful to welcome both of you today, Professor Benitez and Anam, to this discussion. And in terms of an introduction, I just wanted to share some initial thoughts with all of you before I actually pose a number of questions to our panelists today. There's a number of issues that we're going to be covering in the discussion today, and we're going to be exploring particularly how this particular moment of crisis fits within the recent history of US immigration law, institutions, and procedures. And we will also have the opportunity to reflect and discuss where immigration matters are heading in the United States based on contemporary events. We will definitely discuss three issues that are of immense interest at the moment. One of them is the impact of COVID-19 on the practice of immigration law, the potential effect of the results of the upcoming US presidential election on US immigration law, and the connection of immigration issues today with the present and the history of racial discrimination in the United States. Every time I participate in an immigration law event, I always start by saying that I'm actually the daughter of an immigrant. My dad was actually a Cuban immigrant. He came to the United States in the 1960s, fleeing a repressive regime in Cuba and seeking a better life for himself and his family. And for him, the United States was a very special place and the land of freedom, hope, opportunity, and potential. He's now deceased, and may he rest in power. And I always wonder what he would think about the current immigration context and all of the challenges that we see around us nowadays. Thank you all for being here and for being interested in such important issues. I also want to thank our co-sponsors to this event. We have many. We have the American Society of International Law, we have the Washington Foreign Law Society, and we have all these wonderful student associations at GW Law School, the International Law Society, the Immigration Law Society, the Refugee Assistance Project, and the Human Rights Law Society. And one thing that I wanted to ask you all before I start posing questions to our wonderful panelists is to please keep your microphones muted. We want to make sure that we can preserve the bandwidth during the event. And if you have any questions, feel free to incorporate them in the chat function, because we will have space and time to discuss some questions that you want to pose to our speakers today. So without further ado, I actually want to pose the first question to Professor Benitez. And the question is, why have you dedicated your life and career to immigration law?
Thank you, Dean Celorio, Anam, and Sabrina for this invitation for organizing today's presentation. Manuel and Ana Maria Benitez, that's why I'm an immigration lawyer. Manuel and Ana Maria, rest in power, rest in peace, were my parents. They came to the United States from Mexico to better themselves and to better their lives of their children. And now here, 50, 60 years later, I have the privilege of sharing whatever little I know with all of you wonderful people, and maybe help some other non-citizens better their lives and the lives of their children as well.
Thank you, Professor Benitez. And I wanted to continue with a question for Anam. If you could please describe some recent developments in U.S. immigration law and what you understand are the main challenges in the present.
Sure. And I'll just start by saying thank you as well for organizing this. It's been a pleasure working with you, and to Professor Benitez, as he knows, but as everyone doesn't know, he really gave me my start in the immigration field as a 1L at GW. I started at the clinic as my first summer job, and I never really looked back, even after dabbling in a couple other fields. But so thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here today. To answer your question, I think that we could have a 3-day conference on all of the changes in immigration law during the Trump administration and what some of the challenges are in the present, especially for immigration lawyers who represent immigrants presently residing in the U.S. or trying to immigrate to the U.S. at the present time. As far as recent developments in immigration law, we're really seeing bold, sweeping changes across the board from the Trump administration. And it's really a combination of regulatory, policy, and programmatic changes across the board in every part of immigration. Certainly, there has been a focus on the southern border and limiting asylum to those who are fleeing primarily Central American countries and gang violence. Those individuals are seeing less opportunities to seek asylum. And even if they're one of the lucky ones who make it into the country after passing through an inspection or being paroled into the US or entering without inspection, we're seeing many, many hurdles and obstacles to getting the grant of asylum to be able to remain in the United States. We've seen, I believe, over 400 executive actions on immigration during the Trump administration, and that really spans everything from border enforcement, interior enforcement, refugee resettlement, asylum, DACA, the immigration courts, and the visa process from abroad. We've seen during the COVID-19 pandemic an opportunity that the Trump administration has, in my mind, exploited to further its immigration policy aims. We've seen more bans on travel, not only at the southern border, but also from certain countries. And asylum has effectively been ended at the southern border. So what this all means as far as challenges go is that for immigration practitioners like myself, we're really just practicing in this immigration quicksand where we can sign a case one day and give legal advice one day, and within 24 hours, the case has completely changed. And maybe, the arguments that we were prepared to present are no longer viable. Or maybe that client isn't even eligible for the relief that he or she intended to seek. So that makes practicing during this time very difficult. I believe Professor Benitez will be speaking more to that on this panel as well. But it's just been incredibly difficult because not only are there a lot of changes a lot of the changes are relatively thoughtless and are then being immediately challenged in the courts. And thank goodness for those people who are challenging these cases, because we are actually seeing good decisions from federal judges, even some that have been appointed by Republican judges and even President Trump himself, who are reversing some of these new policy changes. But that leads to its own set of challenges because, you know, quite literally mid-case, we can see 3 different cases, you know, a rule being implemented, it being enjoined, the injunction being lifted, and then losing the case at the circuit court. So it's certainly a very difficult time to be an immigration lawyer. So if you know one, buy him or her a drink or give him a hug whenever you see them, because we can certainly use it.
Thank you, Anam, and thank you so much for sharing your practitioner's perspective on a very complex time. And like you said, you know, a time in which immigration lawyers are really operating in quicksand in many ways. And Professor Benitez, I wanted to ask you a question connected to what Anam just shared with us. Aside from the challenges that she just shared with us, we have COVID-19, right, to add to that equation. So if you could talk a little bit about what the impact of COVID-19 has been in an already difficult context.
Sure, Dean. I have 2 responses to that. First, my connection to immigration law and the immigration system dates back to 1984, after my first year of law school when I interned at an immigration firm in Houston. And that's when I started to learn that there was things like immigration courts and INS. It was INS back then. Although being the child of immigrants, I knew about green cards and things like that. So I've been connected in one way or another to the immigration system and the procedures for a few years now. And I can say the immigration agencies have never been well run or well organized as a whole. I do think that there are wonderful people, caring people who work within all of these agencies, but there are individuals who aren't wonderful people and they're not caring people, and some who are just looking to run out the clock and get their pension and move on. So we're not starting before the pandemic from a basis where you had agencies who were well-funded, well-organized, well-missioned, doing their jobs to the best of their abilities. The pandemic hits, and that's my second point. It's a matter of record that COVID-19 has impacted primarily and harshly the communities of color in this community, be it healthcare, be it employment, being public transportation, the fact that so many young people of color don't have good internet, good Wi-Fi, laptops, computers at home, having to go to the library, perhaps having to find a hot spot somewhere in a parking lot where they can do their homework. Again, it's a matter of historical record that that's impacting people of color. Almost by definition, the kinds of populations that Anam and I serve are people of color, because they are people who come from another country. That doesn't exclude people who come from Europe and places like that, but for the most part, we're talking people from Asia, Africa, Latin America. So these are people of color, and they have the added vulnerability of not being in status, not speaking the language, not being eligible for many benefits that US citizens, even people of color US citizens, might have available to them. So COVID has just taken a toll one step further with the kinds of populations that Anam and I represent. Because not only do we have the inefficiencies, now we're talking about something that's lethal or potentially lethal, where the wrong step or not being careful at the right time can cause not only the non-citizen to get sick, but also cause the lawyers to get sick, the immigration judges to get sick, the officers to get sick. And I know Anam is aware, she's very active in immigration court. Not that long ago at the Arlington Immigration Court, where Anam and I practice, there was a breakout of COVID among the staff. So the courts closed that morning and no one knew what was going on and when are the courts going to reopen. So it's not just a challenge nowadays, it's a risk to one's life and safety.
Thank you, Professor Benitez. Amidst all these challenges and this difficult context, we have a presidential election in 2 weeks, right? So in a lot of our minds, we're wondering what can be the effects of this US presidential election. So Anam, if you could share a little bit with us about what you think about the upcoming presidential election.
Sure. So certainly who wins the election in November, or whenever we find out who wins the election, it might not be November anymore, will affect immigration in this country. I'll deal with President Trump first, because I think that's a little easier in some ways, because he's kind of had this trial run during his first presidency. And so I would anticipate more of the same. I would anticipate more of a systemic attack against not only illegal immigration, those who are undocumented in the United States, but also against the lawful immigration process. I imagine that we will see more bureaucracy, more attacks on due process, more backlogs at the immigration court, more visa refusals, and more wall building, more enforcement. I do think that we'll see more of the same. It's been an incredibly active administration on the immigration front. I'm not sure if people really realize that, because not all of the changes make their way to the news. Many of them do, but we're really seeing changes on every level of the process. As I mentioned earlier, we're seeing a lot of programmatic and policy changes. So these aren't even regulatory or executive actions, but maybe the Attorney General just rewrites precedent that affects all victims of domestic violence, or affects anyone who is fleeing gang violence in their country. We'll all know about it. All the immigration attorneys get pinged on our listservs, and everyone freaks out, and we're all talking about it. But something like that isn't necessarily going to make it to the news. So they know what they're doing. They're really exploiting all of the power that they have, because the immigration system is so malleable by who sits in the White House. And I'll get into that a little more later. But the immigration system is largely within the purview of the executive branch. So who is in the White House really does matter. So that's what I anticipate if Trump were to win the election again, and have a second presidency. As far as Biden goes, I mean, both candidates do have their immigration positions on their campaign website. So if anyone is interested in learning more about that, I do refer everyone to that. Biden has promised to, in the first 100 days of his presidency, if he were to win, reverse everything that the Trump administration has promulgated in the first presidency. That's not an easy task, because, as I mentioned, it is a multi-layered approach. So it's really not a matter of just signing one executive order or waving one magic wand and everything will be undone. So that in and of itself is a really tall order. That, in my mind, that is really the most concrete policy proposal that I see on Biden's website as far as immigration goes. I appreciate it. I would like to see that unravel to the extent that it can be if he were to win. I would like to see a little more, but he has more generally committed to principles of reforming the system, keeping families together, reversing prolonged detention and minimizing that, a commitment to due process, a commitment to the fact that this country has been founded on immigrants, and it seems like he and his team seem to understand the importance of those values. But really, as far as who wins the election will definitely, more so than other practice areas, have a huge effect on our day-to-day.
Thank you. And Professor Benitez, thinking of the upcoming presidential election and all of the issues that we have seen this year unravel, really, in many ways, related to racial discrimination and structural racial discrimination that is part of our present, but also part of our past, and it's an ongoing problem in the United States. How do you think this is connected to migration issues and immigration issues? And you started touching on that, but if you could expand on this would be great.
Sure, Dean. Like racial discrimination historically in the United States against African Americans and other ethnicities, to me, I see the connection with the systemic discrimination and racism against non-citizens, coming down to the concept of otherness. Anyone that's other than a particular norm is to be disparaged, is to be attacked. Someone who's of a different religion, someone who dresses differently, someone who speaks differently, someone who has different dietary needs or preferences. They are different, they are dangerous, they are taking something away from us that belongs exclusively to us. And the only way to deal with them is to get them out of here. We're not interested in nuance here. There is no interest in nuance, some of the things that Anam touched upon, which I agree with wholeheartedly. There's a lot of talk in this country, and it's long overdue, about the systemic nature of racism. And there's a systemic aspect of racism when dealing with non-citizens as well, because other than immigrants from certain parts of the world, for the most part, and you can look at the numbers, anybody can look at the numbers, a lot of immigrants come to this country from, as I mentioned, Asia, Africa, Latin America. There are also immigrants that come from these countries that are well-to-do. They come on business visas, but for the most part, we have a lot of influx to this country. We had a lot of influx to this country from people fleeing persecution. These are people who tend to be more vulnerable in their country. They don't have the protection of the authorities in their country. They come here because they knew that the United States was a place of protection, regardless of where they may be, regardless of what their color may be. And I'll leave you on this topic with one example from very recent history, and that deals with the number of refugees that the United States admits. You all may have been aware that within the last 2 or 3 weeks, the United States announced that it was reducing the number of refugees to 15,000 for the upcoming fiscal year. My memory from the last year or years of the prior administration, and maybe Anam has the numbers specifically, but my memory is that the numbers back then were upwards of 100,000 refugees being admitted per year. And that's a big difference. That's a big difference. People who are fleeing as refugees tend to be people who are vulnerable in their country. They're coming to seek protection. And if they're not going to get protection here, where are they?
Thank you, Professor Benitez. I have a follow-up question for Anam on this. Which do you believe are the 3 main areas that need reform in the field of immigration law in the United States? And it'll be great if you share some of your experiences through the work that you have been doing as a practitioner.
Sure. So I've heard folks say that 2 of the most complicated areas of the law are tax law and immigration law. I don't practice tax law, but just from doing my own taxes, it seems quite complicated. And immigration is certainly in that wheelhouse of being incredibly complicated. It's a broken system in a lot of ways. And I think regardless of your political leanings, everyone can agree on that. It's just a matter of deciding how to best fix it and what is the most viable means of fixing it, because we need to be realistic as well. If I could think of 3 main areas as the question's been proposed, I would first address the situation of undocumented people living and working in the United States, which includes Dreamers, those who have DACA, Deferred Action Childhood Arrival. I would improve the family and employment-based immigration paths. And then lastly, I would fix the immigration court system. And specifically, we need an independent Article 1 court. So I'll just touch on each of those very briefly. So as to the first, there are about 10 to 11 million undocumented people in the United States. Most of these people are law-abiding, tax-paying, hardworking individuals who are paying into a system that they are never going to get or see the benefits for. They're essential to our economy. Our economy is really built on their backs. I believe I saw a statistic that 1 in 20 workers in the United States are undocumented. By asking these people to come out of the shadows, register with the government, pay a fee, go through security checks, and earn the privilege of some sort of permanent status in the United States, we will all benefit from that as a country. We can restore the rule of law in not only our communities, but also our workplaces. And we can really maximize the contributions that undocumented people are already making in this country and just formalize it. Second, the family and employment-based processes are much more complicated and difficult than they need to be. Right now, there are backlogs of multiple years. You can be in a backlog of up to 20 years just to be reunited with your family, and that's just not working. These families are separated, and we need to restore the value that our country has been dedicated to, which has been to keep families together. Similarly, there are many backlogs in the employment-based arena as well. As a result, we are losing a lot of high-skilled workers from certain countries specifically, and we want to reduce the backlogs with employment-based petitions so that we can attract and retain the best and brightest from all over the world, and this will increase our competitiveness in the global economy as well. And lastly, and this is really an issue that I feel very, very strongly about as someone who practices before the immigration courts on a daily basis. The immigration courts are broken and we need an independent Article 1 court. Immigration courts currently are part of the Department of Justice, which a lot of people don't realize. So that's overseen by the Attorney General. And for those who don't know, DOJ, where the immigration courts decide if someone is going to get deported or be allowed to stay in the United States, is the same agency that prosecutes immigrants for coming into the United States in federal courts. So there's a conflict of interest that's built into the system itself. These immigration judges are basically glorified government attorneys. It's highly politicized because it is under the executive branch. There's no independence. There's relatively no neutrality anymore. And as a result, there's no due process, which the Supreme Court has found does apply in immigration court, and there's no credibility or efficiency into the system. So it's very easy to manipulate the system based on who is in the White House. And the Trump administration has exploited that and has taken advantage of the structural flaws in the system to undermine judicial independence. So by completely restructuring the immigration courts to an independent Article 1 court, we can protect due process and make sure that the immigrants who are seeking to stay in this country have their rights preserved so that we can have a more independent and impartial immigration court. So those would be my three general fixes. I have many others, but I won't bore everyone with those. But those are my general fixes to the immigration system, among many others.
Thank you, Anam. And at the end of the day, I mean, you're describing, like you said, a broken system, a system that really needs substantial reform. And thinking about basically the features of the system right now, I have a final question for Professor Benitez before we open the discussion to questions. I wanted to ask you about the role of legal education and law schools in this particular system with so many challenges. And please share some examples of the work that your immigration law clinic is doing to address the current challenges.
Well, thank you, Dean. And my answer is, in all seriousness, I think the greatest contribution that those of us who direct immigration clinical programs, and I want to throw a shout out to two people if I could. First, my wife Janice, who's been a supporter of mine and clinical legal education for years. We're coming up on our 27th wedding anniversary on October 30th, so she's been a fan of the work that I do ever since. And also to my colleague in the immigration clinic, Paulina Vera. The greatest contribution, Dean, is helping young law students and lawyers who want to become immigration lawyers to get started to become immigration lawyers. I'm happy to talk to you about cases and things like that, but we have Anam here, who's an alum of the immigration clinic. We have Professor Vera, who I see is joined us. And then just looking at some of the names of people that are with us here today, we have student attorneys and alums from the immigration clinic who could be doing other stuff right now, and yet they're tuned in to hear what we have to say. I think I think immigration clinics have a unique place in legal education because immigration clinics have offer all the skills that many different clinical legal education programs offer, but the clientele tends not to speak English. So that's an added challenge that student attorneys need to deal with. Clinical programs, the kind that Professor Veda and I direct, is very hands-on, as Anam learned in the time that she worked with us. There's plenty of research, there's plenty of time to nerd out and discuss fine points of immigration law. But the kind of work that we focus on is helping people get their green cards, helping people stay safe, helping people reunite. Our unofficial motto in the GW Immigration Clinic is saving lives and reuniting families. So when the time comes for me to move on from doing whatever it is that I do and turning it over to Anam and Professor Veda and all the other people, if I've been able to maybe help someone along the path to becoming an immigration lawyer, I think I would have done my job.
Wonderful, Professor Benitez. And I can safely say that both you and Anam inspire us every day in the work that you do and how dedicated you are, especially in a context that's broken, that's very challenging, and in which you really need to have your heart in the kind of work that you're doing. So I'm extremely grateful for the work that you do and for sharing all of your wisdom and your experience with us today. So now I want to open it to questions from the audience. And if you have any sort of questions, please write them down in the chat. And I also have some questions. I have additional questions for you as well, but I want to see if anybody from the audience has any questions beforehand. I don't see any questions in the chat, so I'm going to continue asking you questions if that's okay with you. So one question that I have for you is that I work very directly in the field of international law, right? And a lot of what this field documents is the complex relationship that the United States has with international law in general, and with foreign affairs in general. So one thing that I wanted to ask you, especially because I see that there's a number of students connected that are pursuing concentrations in international comparative law or are working in international law. How do you see US immigration law issues connected to what the US does internationally in terms of international law and its work with like these major organizations like the United Nations, that they all have, for example, migration experts, and that they do cover migration issues, but at an international level? How do you see the synchronicity between the national and international here?
Are you asking me, Dean Silorio, or Anam?
Well, it could be either of you, whichever wants to speak first.
Anam, why don't you go first and then I'll follow.
Sure. So I'll speak to the practical differences and synchronicity and connection between the two, because I actually went into law school thinking that I would practice international law. Granted, I had a lot to learn about it still, but I was a poli-sci major from GW undergrad. I had languages, backgrounds. I was interested in international issues, and I just thought that that would be an easy fit for me. And I studied international law from arguably the best legal minds in the country, Professor Steinhardt, and it really just didn't click for me. And it seemed a little nebulous, a little too vague to me, and I didn't do particularly well in it because I don't think that it was really a natural fit for how my mind works and my skill set. And so that's when I kind of fell into immigration, and I found that, the human rights issues and the country conditions, and there's certainly an international law component to it. I oftentimes find myself researching, paternity issues in El Salvador, or, same-sex marriages in Colombia, and you do have to do that research, but it's within a more finite structure of the immigration law system. And as broken as it is, we still have a statute, we still have precedent, we still have circuit law cases and SCOTUS cases. So for me, it was, having that international law element, but within a more easy to apply framework. And especially because I got to do the litigation, I get to write briefs, I get to do transactional work. So I've really enjoyed that fit. So that was a connection that I didn't necessarily anticipate coming into law school, and everything worked out great. But I'll let Professor Benitez speak to maybe some of the larger issues there.
Well, thank you, Anam. You're very kind and generous, but frankly, I think the way Anam does, I have this fancy title of professor, but I'm envious of people like Anam, and I love going to court and I love doing interviews and so forth. But like Anam, she's very modest. We can nerd out about the large international issues with the best of them. I say this with all seriousness, Dean. Anyone who's an immigration lawyer, I believe, is also an international lawyer because, as you all know, or you may know, so many concepts from US immigration law come from international law, specifically in the area of asylum. The protocols for the protection of refugees, I know I'm getting the names messed up, but they were all incorporated into domestic law in 1980 with the US Refugee Act. So persecution, well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, political opinion. That all comes from international law. So any law students or any lawyers who are thinking, well, I really want to do international law, but becoming the general secretary of the UN seems like it's a really far off job for me to get. You can get it someday. But if you do US immigration law, you're an international lawyer too, because as Anam said, you have to learn the law of Germany, you have to learn the law of China, you have to learn domestic relations law in Nigeria. It's not just sort of sitting with the US Immigration and Nationality Act and focusing on that. The United States was, and hopefully starting on January 20th, 2021, we will once again be part of the international community. And I welcome anybody who wants to join us to become an immigration lawyer.
I think it's a wonderful area of the law. And I say this as an international law practitioner in many ways. I do think it's an essential part of international law. And I want to make sure that our students understand that as well. So I have actually 2 questions from the audience, which is great. I have one from Paulina Vera. And she's asking, what can law students who are interested in practicing immigration law do to best prepare themselves for working in this area of the law, which has been described in this presentation as complex, fast-paced, constantly changing, and riddled with problems, both systemic and political?
Anna, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. Hi, Paulina. I like this question. And I think you're going to like how I answer this because I know this is important to you as well. I just think it's very important for students to take care of themselves and to be self-aware of what your limits are and what your boundaries are, because immigration law is complex, it's fast-paced, but it's also very difficult for a lot of other reasons. We are, for the most part, dealing with a very traumatized, vulnerable group of people who do not have all of the opportunities and resources that many people with status in the United States have. And especially law students who come into immigration law thinking, I want to help people, I want to keep families together. There's a tendency to give all of yourself to your cases. And I think that that is very important. I think passion and zeal will serve you very well in immigration law. And I actually don't think you can practice immigration law without a passion for helping immigrants. But at the same time, vicarious trauma and burnout are huge effects of in immigration law that many people don't talk enough about. So my advice would just be to not to worry much about reading cases and reading the statute. You will be trained at your job based on how they want you to do it. And this comes as someone who, who's a partner at a firm and does hire law students. I'm not looking necessarily for your immigration and your experience in immigration, looking more for a passion and a self-awareness and also just having limits, learning how to say no to certain cases, learning your boundaries with clients so that you're not, answering phone calls 24/7 and things like that too. So that would just be my one piece of advice to students who are looking into working in immigration law.
And Professor Benitez, I don't know if you have anything else to add?
No, I have nothing to add. Anam said it better than I ever could.
Well, thank you. I have another question. This one is from Mohammed Rahman. He's a physician, and he's saying, just listening to Anam, the legal system seems so dysfunctional. Is it even realistic to expect any change, even with Joe Biden as president?
Want to take this one on, Anna?
So I will say that's my dad. Hi, Dad. Thanks for listening. I will say that I think it's a good question. And I don't know if we will see sweeping change with Joe Biden as president. I think that we can expect reversal of Trump's actions. I think that's a realistic expectation, and that will save hundreds of thousands of lives. So I don't want to mitigate that. That in and of itself will be huge. At the same time, the Obama administration was highly criticized by immigrant advocates. President Obama was informally known as the deporter-in-chief. The roots of family separation really started during the Obama administration and were escalated during the Trump administration. So I think there are certainly a lot of advocates who are skeptical of seeing really broad sweeping change. I think President Biden would have to work with Congress to really have any sweeping comprehensive reform. And we all know how Congress works in the current age. But like I said, I think that even just a reversal of the current Trump policies would have a material effect on saving people's lives and keeping families together.
Dean, could I weigh in a little bit also?
Yes, of course.
Two comments. First, Dr. Rahman, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for contributing 50% of Anam. My second comment was actually, I think, somewhat of a medical comment, and there's a difference between the common cold and the flu. I think this current administration is the flu taken to the max, whereas Joe Biden administration would be the common cold. I think Joe Biden is a decent man. I think his heart is in the right place. I think the kinds of people that he picks as Attorney General and Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security will be very different than the kind of people that the current administration has in those jobs. Will a Joe Biden administration have the kinds of policies related to immigration that and if I could speak for Anam believe in? Certainly not to the extent that an Attorney General, Anam Rahman, would have, or a Secretary of Homeland Security, Alberto Benitez, would have. And here is why I think that might be the case. As I mentioned at the beginning, I've been learning about this immigration system now for quite a few years, both Republican and Democratic administrations, starting with Ronald Reagan. And the Democrats, while in the administration, have never had the equivalent of what the Republicans have had for the past 4 years in this gentleman by the name of Stephen Miller, whose whole purpose in life is to destroy the immigration system. And I think he's been quoted as saying that his goal is for there not to be a single other immigrant to ever enter the United States. That is the man's single purpose in his professional life, although he's not responsible for the policies. His boss is responsible for the policies. I don't foresee, because there never has been an equivalent in a Democratic administration, who would be there not only to undo all the things that Stephen Miller has done, but to really know the system the way Stephen Miller or his compatriots know the system, to fix what needs to be fixed. Because, for example, we always hear a lot about these broad systemic changes, which are wonderful, but you also need to have independent immigration judges, such as Anam mentioned, and you need to have adjudicators that are allowed to make decisions based on their best decision and information. And that's really only can be done by people who know the system inside. So I'm going to put a plug in for Anam Rahman to get a job with the next administration to fix all the things that need to be fixed.
Dr. Rahman, thank you so much for being here with us today. You did just what my mom usually does when she connects to this event. She starts asking questions and nobody necessarily knows that she's my mom. So thank you for that.
So the only reason I attended this thing was that I don't see Anam live. So I just wanted to watch her. That was the only reason to attend this. But obviously, Anam had spoken very highly of Professor Benitez. She had mentioned a number of times. So I saw his name and I said, this is a good time to listen. But I'm a physician. I'm actually an oncologist. I'm a cancer specialist. And the message comes home to me when Anam said it's about saving lives. That's what I do every day. And I'm not making a big deal out of it. I've been a physician for 30 years, but oncologist saves lives, and immigration they're kind of common threads there that link the two together. And just listening was a privilege because just to see what's going on in Anam's life and what she's doing. But I think you guys are doing a great job. It's just a pleasure and a privilege to just listen to you guys. So carry on the good work. I love it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rahman. Words of wisdom. A lot of words of wisdom. Thank you for being with us.
I didn't even know people could get on video with questions. So now I know.
We have 2 more questions, actually. We have a great audience.
Love you, Dad.
Thank you, Dr. Rahman. So we have a question from Sierra Wade, and she's asking, I saw a video of a 2-year-old child in 2018 who was forced to testify without representation in immigration court. Since the likelihood of deportation varies so much for children depending on if they have representation or not, what do you think would be the best way to address this?
Anam, go ahead.
Sure, and I do see a few questions, so I'll try and be as concise as possible. I think that the solution to that is universal representation. I think we start with the children, certainly, because they're in a more vulnerable group, and that just seems like a commonsensical way to pilot the program. But, immigration cases, especially in court, have been described by an immigration judge as death penalty cases in a traffic court setting. So the more that, an attorney is quite literally the difference between life and death. The system is incredibly complicated, as we've discussed. You cannot navigate it without an attorney. The sooner they get an attorney, the better, because oftentimes the children age out. By the time that they're 18, they have less protections and less options. So I do think that universal representation is where we need to go, starting with the little kiddies in immigration court.
Dean, everything that Anam said, I agree with. I just want to clarify one thing, just so everybody knows. Immigration law is civil, so there is no system of assigned counsel. And I believe Anam would agree with me that the standard is non-citizens are entitled to representation at no cost to the government. So if they can get representation, if they can afford representation or pro bono representation, then that's what they will get. And if they can't, then they won't.
Thank you. I have a question from Humeira Sirit. She's actually my student. Not a question, but as a foreign lawyer and a person who recently migrated to the United States, I also found a chance to make an internship in a law firm in New York. I witnessed many traumatic cases during my internship and in my country, especially with the Syrian refugees. I think whatever career path we follow, all lawyers should be concerned about the unsystematic practices in immigration law and try to do something about it because it is directly related to people's lives. Thank you to both speakers for all of the valuable information. And Humeira, we really echo what you just said as well. We have a question from Chris Schumacher. What might be the implications of Judge Barrett's nomination to the Supreme Court regarding immigration law?
Anna?
I'm not certain about the implications of that, so I don't want to speak to something that I'm not an expert on. I think that we have seen with some of the more conservative judges that Trump has appointed that they have been actually a little difficult to predict as far as where they came down on certain issues, especially with the DACA SCOTUS decision that came down earlier this year. We were all bracing for the worst. And I think that was a very realistic outcome that we were expecting DACA to completely go away based on the makeup of the Supreme Court with RBG even on it. So, and then we got good news there. We got good news with the gay marriage case as well. The name of the case is escaping me. So I think it's hard to say. Certainly with a more Scalia-like originalism background, that could not bode well for certain immigration cases, but a lot of our issues are statutory that end up in the Supreme Court in the immigration realm. So it might not all be all immigrants bad, like let's keep everyone out. I don't think that anyone can really say that about Judge Barrett. And if she were to become a justice. So I'm actually not certain about that.
Dean, could I answer that also?
Of course.
The Remain in Mexico program, the MPP, the Migrant Protection Protocols, as it's euphemistically known, is a particular area of concern for me. I have actually taken some time to study it. Read the statute that controls and followed it from the district court in California through the Court of Appeals. Judge Barrett, perhaps Justice Barrett, it will be a test of whether she is a textualist or not, and what kind of a textualist she is. Because if she is, as she and her supporters say that she is, a principled textualist who applies the law as written, then she should vote against the Remain in Mexico program. Because anyone who wants to read the relevant section, I apologize, I don't have the section with me right now, will see that the Remain in Mexico program has no basis in the law. A federal district judge ruled that way, and a panel of the Ninth Circuit, and I believe the entire Ninth Circuit, ruled exactly the same way, based on the plain language of the statute. That's what her mentor, Justice Scalia, was all about, right? The plain language of the statute. We'll see, as I said, whether she's a principled textualist or a results-oriented textualist.
Thank you. I have a question from Natalie Puletti, and it's, do you recommend aspiring immigration lawyers to learn a second language? How do you overcome any language barriers with your clients to effectively communicate?
So I do recommend that. I speak Spanish. I understand Urdu. I wish my Urdu were better, but I use my Spanish every day with my clients. And I do believe that that is very important to me in establishing a rapport and trust with my clients. As I mentioned, many of them are trauma survivors and victims of persecution or torture. And to get language out of the way is just one less barrier for us to overcome in them telling me some of the most difficult parts of their lives. You don't need to speak another language. So if you don't speak a second language, don't think immigration law isn't for you. It may just affect the type of place that you work at in the immigration law profession. Maybe you'll do a little more policy. Maybe you'll luck out and you'll be at a firm where they do have a lot of interpreters or translators on hand. So you might just have to be a little more creative in finding the right fit for you. But certainly if you want direct representation and if you want to do more removal deportation work, the reality is that most of those individuals do speak Spanish, and having Spanish is a huge asset. But also changes what, it depends on where you work. Maybe if you're up in New York, where there's more of a Chinese population, speaking Mandarin will really help you there. So it really also depends what geographically where you are and what the immigration population looks like there.
Dean, I echo everything that Anam says. I would add one thing though, or two things if I could. In the immigration clinic, the last time I checked, we represent clients from 29 different countries. Paulina and I both speak Spanish. A significant number of our clients are Spanish speakers. A significant number of our student attorneys are Spanish speakers, and other languages as well. But there's just no way we're going to be able to cover the full range of 29 countries. It's just not possible. So that's where the issue of interpreters and translators comes in, professional interpreters and translators. I think that that's the way to go. I caution everyone to do the best they can in trying to get professional interpreters and translators, but they cost money. Perhaps volunteer interpreters and translators would be an option, but never should family or friends of the client be used as an interpreter if at all possible, other than for scheduling the appointment. Okay, can she be here at 5 o'clock on Tuesday and make sure she brings all the documents, for example. You don't want a child or a sibling or a spouse translating or interpreting about some gang rape or some torture or something. And also friends and family, unless you happen to know the language, may want to help and add things. And if you don't know the language, you don't know what is being discussed. So those would be my comments that I would add to what Anam has shared.
Thank you so much to both Professor Alberto Benitez and Anam Rahman for all the wonderful wisdom and information that they have shared with us today. I think they're an example of the dedication and the passion and the hard work that you really need to address such a challenging area of the law. So thank you both for being here today with us. And thank you for all of you who connected tonight, who dedicated this time to this event. And I hope that you leave in some way hopeful and also thinking of ways in which we can address the current problems and challenges. Thank you so much for connecting this evening. Have a good night.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dean.
All right, good night. Thank you, Dean Rosa.